It's happening again.
Well, it's the first big release of 2022, and Hollywood is bringing back another famous franchise. This time it's Scream, and let's be honest, it was a question of when, not if, Ghostface was going to make his return to the big screen. It's a franchise known for its deconstruction of the horror genre, for its meta commentary and satire. Nobody can really blame a Scream movie for being self-referential because that's always been their thing. So, considering the state of franchises and reboots these days, how could Hollywood possibly resist? Now, the original Scream is one of my favorite movies of all time, and yes, you heard that right, not just one of my favorite horror movies, but genuinely one of my all-time favorites. The entire Scream franchise, even with its ups and downs, is one of the few I actually enjoy. It's something I'm obviously very nostalgic about, but also, for the most part, it aged well and still holds up. So being the toxic fangirl that I am, I was excited to see this movie even though I didn't have very high expectations going in, since this is the first Scream film without Wes Craven. And guess what? Scream 5 surprised me by being better than I thought it would be. I had fun. I also had my issues with it, which I will get into, but as for my overall reaction to the film, I had a good time. I'm going to keep calling it Scream 5, by the way, because that's what it is. I get that they made fun of this and people like me in the movie. I get it. You gave it the original title to mess with people. Cool. It's Scream 5. Scream is the original.
Stop trying to make fetch happen.
The setup for Scream 5 will sound familiar to anyone who has ever seen or even heard of a Scream movie. After a brutal opening scene, it's clear that Ghostface is back in the town of Woodsboro and dead bodies are about to start piling up. The only questions are who's getting stabbed next and who is behind the mask this time. Now, when you hear this description, you might wonder, why do people still even care about this franchise? How can slashers with this simple of a premise, because yes, this is the premise for every Scream movie, remain relevant and effective for decades? First and foremost, the majority of Scream films strike that magical balance that so many mainstream horror movies struggle with. They're effective horror films and legitimate murder mysteries, but also have just the right amount of humor, a lot of which comes from that sharp meta commentary, which cuts deep into genre tropes, horror fandoms, Hollywood, and media. Even at its lowest point, Scream 3, the franchise always had something new to offer, something interesting to say, and some brutal kills to go along with all of it. And second, of course, it's the characters. Whether we're talking about the iconic masked villains, the legendary final girls, Sydney and Gale, or the plethora of memorable side characters, Scream has managed to make people care about who lives and who dies. Plus, the killers always have an actual motive. So let's address the elephant in the room. All of the previous Scream films came from one of the masters of horror, Wes Craven, and Scream 5 is the first one without him. Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillette, the directors of Ready or Not, had some very big shoes to fill here. How did they do? Pretty well, and it seems that the majority of the audiences are welcoming this new chapter with pretty open arms. While they did mostly stick to recycling elements of the previous films in the franchise, and the meta aspect got a little bit out of hand in the third act, overall, it's a decent horror movie that fits with the other four, and as a longtime fan of the franchise, I would be interested in seeing where they take it from here. But I think it's time we got into all of the fun details of what I liked and didn't like about Scream 5, and for that, we're going to have to dive into spoilers. You've been warned, so let's start at the beginning, because what is Scream without a killer opening scene?
Would you like to play a game, Tara?
The original opening for Scream is, to this day, one of the most iconic and horrifying scenes within the genre. Drew Barrymore's demise is as brutal as it is sad, and at the time was definitely unexpected. Since then, every sequel in the franchise has killed off the characters it opened with, but here's a plot twist from Scream 5. the intended first victim survives. The scene itself undeniably lives up to the rest of the franchise. It's tense, it's brutal, the dialogue that escalates from being playful to menacing is very effective, and it's a great reminder of what these movies are like. One minute the characters are talking about horror films, and next thing you know, someone is getting stabbed. Basically, we're off to a great start. Here's where things get a bit less confident though, the characters. Now obviously, Scream 5 is introducing a whole new cast and actively trying to transition away from the legacy characters, but the way they chose to do it feels a bit lazy and lackluster. Our opening scene survivor, Tara, played by Jenna Ortega, spends most of the movie in the hospital, which means she's not the lead character here. Instead, our lead is Tara's sister, Sam, played by Melissa Barrera, who turns out to be the secret daughter of Billy Loomis, because Scream 5 is actually kind of a soap opera. Look, the franchise has done the whole related to the original characters thing before, but at least it was used sparingly and actually mattered for the plot. This time around, there are a lot of new characters who are somehow related to older characters, and the main purpose of this is just to give the audience a reason to care about them because of nostalgia. This is what I mean by lazy. If you say someone is related to a fan favorite, Randy, they're immediately more interesting to the audience whether there's actual character work there or not, which in this case there really isn't. If you say someone is related to Billy Loomis, they immediately seem more dangerous because this is a movie and why else would they include that? So instead of actually creating an interesting cast of likable, memorable characters, the movie in most cases just leans on bloodlines in an attempt to make you care, which just isn't strong writing. There are two potentially interesting characters within the new cast. The feisty opening scene survivor, Tara, who unfortunately isn't the lead, and Randy's niece, Mindy, who is entertaining because she is the exact type of character Randy was. But neither of them is in the movie as much as you would hope, and the rest are, well, your bland slasher movie young people, including Sam Carpenter. Points for that last name though. Sam, our lead and Tara's estranged sister, returns to Woodsboro with her boyfriend Richie after she finds out Tara was attacked. We soon learn why she disappeared from her sister's life for years, which involves the soap opera twist of her being the daughter of Billy Loomis, but the point is she's supposed to be brooding and mysterious because of the dark secret she's been carrying around. Also, Sam apparently has visions of him ominously taunting her, in which he, for some reason, appears the way he looked on the night he was killed. Listen, we already did the visions of a dead parent thing back in Scream 3. It didn't work there, and it still doesn't work here. It's a weird way to bring another original character back for a few minutes, and it gets even weirder when the movie implies Sam has some serial killer side to her, as if that's hereditary. But then it's kind of a good thing that she uses to her advantage at the end while delivering one of the cheesiest lines of the entire movie. Never mess with the daughter of a serial killer. She also eventually has some oddly peaceful and approving father-daughter moment with imaginary Billy. Now, I get that the movie was most likely implying she's managed to finally accept herself and make peace with who she is, even though her father is a murderer. But on screen, this ended up looking as some kind of strange atta-girl moment with a killer, and it just was not working for me. These visions were one scene away from Billy redeeming himself as a helpful guiding ghost. Just stop it. Oh, and then there is Stu Macher's nephew, Vince, who dies. That's it. He's just there to be a body. As for the three legacy characters, Sydney and Gail are not in the movie that much, which is especially a bummer when it comes to Gail. She's such a fun, fiery, motivated character, and yet she barely has anything to do here. It's a huge missed opportunity. The only legacy character who gets to do something interesting is Dewey. He was definitely the standout of Scream 5 for me. He tried to help all of those newcomers, killers and paid for it with his life. I'm not going to lie, I had a feeling he was going to get killed, especially considering how much screen time he was getting, but I was still really upset that they did this. Why did you have to hurt me like that, movie? And to be fair, this is easily the most emotionally impactful moment of the entire film for any fan of the franchise, and a really epic kill for Ghostface, so it makes sense why they went there. Plus, the original trio was kind of getting invincible, but it doesn't mean I like it. Not to mention, after you realize this was supposedly Amber who overpowered and killed him, that scene really starts losing its believability, as menacing as it looks. Here's a problem this presents though. They killed Dewey when Gale and Dewey together are the beating heart of this franchise. They also failed to create a true meaningful connection for the audience to the new characters, or replace them with a dynamic anywhere near as compelling as the one Gale and Dewey had. So good luck trying to work with that in the next sequel. But let's talk about the killers and the mystery. As far as the violence itself goes, Scream 5 is pretty brutal and entirely valid as a modern slasher. There are plenty of moments that will make you squirm, and while Ghostface is very hit or miss on finishing people off this time around for some reason, things still get pretty gory and intense. As far as the basic slasher aspect goes, Scream 5 definitely succeeds. But wow, did they make the killers obvious in this one. I'm sorry, I just don't buy this whole idea of this was obvious on purpose, and if it actually was, I don't think that was the right move. It's one thing to be self-aware or to poke fun at the genre and other films in the franchise, with an occasional self-referential wink here and there, but it's a whole different story when the entire mystery aspect is painfully obvious. You just can't write that off as actually clever because it's intentional at that point. The murder mystery aspect of the Scream franchise has always been part of the fun, even when a few plot twists got a bit ridiculous, like the secret brother reveal of Scream 3, but Scream 5 goes so overboard with the red herring that you almost immediately know what's going on. Between the reiterated rules, the whole requel concept, and the very small number of characters the movie isn't trying to point the suspicion finger at, you really don't have that many options left. Because what do you know? It's Amber, one of the least suspicious people with a constant evil smirk on her face, and Richie, the main character's love interest. Their motive? They are angry Stab fans, which is the franchise within the Scream franchise about the Woodsboro murders. They're essentially the equivalent of Scream movies within the Scream movies.
How meta can you get?
What can you get?
So the two of them are really pissed about Stab 8, and they are trying to save the Stab franchise by providing a new killing spree for the new movie to follow, taking things back to basics and back to what the die-hard fans want to see. Because clearly the franchise got out of hand, and these fans, they just love the original so much, they are willing to kill for it. Literally. I mean, we've all seen the online discourse revolving around popular franchises, and Scream 5 is very much pushing the Star Wars toxic fandom angle here, so even though it's a bit over the top, I really like it, and I think it's a very Scream motive. The problem is, this twist comes in on top of already existing meta overload in Act 3, which makes it feel like they're trying way too hard. Act 3 in general is where the movie fell apart for me. Not only did they go too far with the meta, but they also completely abandoned any attempts at reason and realism. For example, earlier in the movie, when we see Tara at the hospital, her injuries actually matter. She can barely get out of bed and move around. So when Ghostface comes for her, you feel her helplessness and the urgency for someone to step in. But then in Act 3, people are getting shot and stabbed in the abdomen left and right and just continue running around and fighting?
'Tis but a scratch.
Not that this is a never-before-seen issue for horror movies or even the Scream franchise, but if it looks ridiculous, I'm going to call it out. On top of this, for all of their jokes about sequel rules, requel rules, and toxic fandoms, Scream 5 doesn't actually follow through by standing out on its own or introducing anything all that new. It relies on the rest of the franchise and constantly recycles elements and characters from the other movies. This still works. The movie is entertaining. It manages to effectively play with the audience on quite a few occasions. It has some interesting ideas, and the meta was actually done well in the first 2 acts, but with Act 3, once they really start laying into the meta and the references while throwing logic and consistency out the window, instead of really bringing it home, the movie suffers, and by the end, it is potentially more derivative than any of the previous sequels. Don't get me wrong though, I will still take Scream 5 over the new Halloween movies, but that's also because Scream is generally a better franchise than Halloween. I said what I said. But if I were to rank Scream movies, I would say Scream 3 is still the worst, even though it has its moments. Then I would go with Scream 5, which is genuinely entertaining until it goes overboard. Then for number 3, I'd go with Scream 4, which is better than you remember it to be, even with the hazy filter. Trust me, I just rewatched all of them. Then at number 2 is Scream 2, which is really good. But let's be real, we all know the original is the best movie. And if you disagree, I mean, I respect your opinion and all that, but what's your favorite scary movie?